Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here to answer a very interesting question that a viewer proposed, and it's this. Why did composers in the Baroque and Classical periods generally write so much more music than composers in the Romantic and, dare I say, modern periods, contemporary periods? Oh, there are so many possible answers to this question, but it's a very, very good question. And it's one that anybody who's, trolling their way through the world of classical music is going to encounter, because you're going to notice that Haydn wrote 107 symphonies or so, and he wasn't even one of the largest producers of such things, and 68 string quartets, whereas already with Beethoven, you've got 9 symphonies and 16 string quartets, and it gets less and less as we go on through the period. So let's talk about, there are 2 major answers. One, of course, that you've already surmised, and that the proposer of the question already surmised, which is a change in musical aesthetics. And we'll talk about the impact that has on composers' fecundity, or productivity, however you want to say it, in a moment. But first, what we really need to consider is patterns of musical employment. It's really very simple. And consumption. Let's say you're a composer in the Baroque or other period. Let's say you're Bach, for example, and you're working for the town of Leipzig. And the town of Leipzig says, listen, we need a new cantata every week for the entire liturgical year for as long as you're employed. So what does that mean? That means at a minimum, you're going to be doing, 50 some odd cantatas every year, plus special occasions and commissioned opportunities, and you have to churn these suckers out to order. You have to. That's your job. So if you don't do it, you're going to get fired. Or let's say you work for some major noble person, and the noble person has a full-scale freestanding orchestra and says, I'm spending a fortune to keep this orchestra on salary, and you are going to write music for them as much as I ask you to, as frequently as I ask you to. Well, what do you think's going to happen? This was their job. The fact of the matter is the pattern of patronage of music back in the Baroque and Classical eras was very simple. The music that we listened to was the product either of an aristocratic mandate. You were hired by a prince or a king. You were a servant, an actual servant, tasked with producing music for every single possible occasion and purpose that they want you to do it for. Full time, full stop. So yeah, you're going to churn out a lot of stuff. And the other thing is that you're either working for that or you're working for the church, where you have the same situation. There are musical occasions happening every single week. You need new music constantly. You have to perform, you have to sing, you have to play, you have to compose. Or possibly, as in Bach's case, which was the earlier version of this, municipal employment by a town. And the model for municipal employment was, of course, aristocratic employment. That is, you had a musical establishment, and somebody ran the musical establishment for the town and had to produce all the music that the whole town needed on demand. So you got tons and tons and tons of music. That's the economic explanation. And it's a very sensible one, a very logical one. I'm sure you'll agree. I mean, if that's what you did for a living, then that's what you did, period. Today, there are equivalents today. Film music composers, music for commercials. There are composers who write music commercially, and they have to produce on demand. Someone who writes film scores, writes dozens and dozens and dozens of them, and only has 2 weeks to produce 2 hours of music. And they have a staff. I mean, Haydn, we always think about these people as being solitary, composing masterpieces, in their broom closet, for the delectation of future generations. That isn't how it happened at all. Haydn had a staff. His staff included copyists who wrote out all the parts by hand for the whole orchestra, could write out scores. He could do things in shorthand and hand it to somebody and say, here, finish this. There was a musical establishment, which is just like the musical establishment in Hollywood. You have the composer who writes the music. Maybe he'll score his own work, as Bernard Herrmann did, or maybe he will or she, pardon me, I have to be politically correct, will have assistants orchestrate it and arrange it and do whatever they need to do. Or they will just write the main tunes and other people will elaborate them and do things. I mean, there was a musical establishment. So the point I want to make is that whenever you have a musical establishment, a corporation, a group of people all working on this one thing for one person on demand, you're going to get a lot of stuff. You're going to get as much stuff as the employer demands. So that's what these people did. Now, the reason the quality of some of this stuff is so high is because some of these people were geniuses and because there was so much musical activity going on. Because remember, there were no recordings. There was nothing electric. If you wanted music, you had to make it yourself. And when everybody is doing it, there will be a cream that rises to the crop, to the top, the cream that rises to the top. And that's who we're going to pay most attention to. And some of these people will have just been fantastically prolific. So that accounts for the Baroque and Classical periods. Now, in the Romantic period, the pattern of patronage changed considerably. Composers were no longer working mostly for aristocratic households. They were working for towns, municipalities, who were notoriously stingy. And beyond that, they were not writing music to order. Most of them were not professional composers at all in the 19th and 20th century. There is, in Italy, you could make a living writing operas like Verdi did. Wagner was always short of money and was completely impractical. If he hadn't been supported by King Ludwig II of Bavaria, we wouldn't have anything of his mature work. Some composers, like Brahms, actually made a living as a composer, but he was one of the very, very few. Most of them were doing other things. They were performers, like Liszt. They played the piano or they did something. They were teachers. They were strolling virtuosi. They did all kinds of other things. They were in music publishing. They had other business interests. The 19th century is full of composers who were not full-time composers. I mean, in Russia, you had Borodin, who was like a chemist. And in France, you had composers like Roussel, who were Navy people. They still managed to write a considerable amount of music. But even the ones who were pretty prolific often had to do other things. That slowed them down, first of all. Second of all, the Romantic aesthetic was different. The Baroque and Classical periods enjoyed what we call a common practice. In the broadest sense, tonality, writing tonal music, is a common practice, right? Everybody writes music that's normally tonal in a key, and the conventions of writing it and notating it have been the same for hundreds of years. Until the 20th century, when atonality and other systems of musical aesthetics took over. But this was happening in the Romantic period. Romantic composers, starting with Beethoven, really, who was a classical transitional composer, were tasked with creating music in which originality was a major thing. Your music had to be original. It had to be personal. It had to sound like nobody else. In the classical period, that wasn't the point at all. I mean, in the Baroque period, everybody was setting the same librettos, the same texts, the same everything, the same stories. I mean, you had singers who had their own arias they would insert into an opera. And so the need to personalize your music was much, much, much less. But in the Romantic period, you had to write masterpieces. Every piece was an individual thing. It had to be different from all the other individual things. And the aesthetics, because there were big orchestras and the size of the orchestra grew and instruments were improved and the technical virtuosity increased, and all of these things were happening simultaneously. And as a result of that, music became more complex to notate, not necessarily more complex in terms of structure. You could argue that the music of Bach and Mozart and Haydn and Beethoven was as complex as tonal music was ever to get. And everything else was all downhill after that. Some people maintain that. But I can show this to you very, very simply. I mean, a picture is worth 1,000 videos, right? 1,000 words. Here is Handel's opera. Which one is it? Orlando. Typical Handel opera. Handel could churn one of these things out in about 6 weeks or so, on average. The opera is going to have, let's just look at it, tons and tons and tons of recitative. Now, what's recitative? Recitative is when you're basically singing dialogue. over just like a light keyboard, harpsichord, or forte piano accompaniment with some strings. Most composers didn't even bother to write these things down in any detail. So let me show you what that looks like, and this would take up quite a bit of time in your average opera. Let's see. Here we have. Oh, here's a recitative. This is an accompanied recitative with instruments. Sometimes you had like string accompaniment, and sometimes you just had like just a light keyboard thing. Here's a typical recitative. Ta-da! Look at that. You have the vocal line here on top, and down here you have the accompanying harmonies. Now, these are written out for the purposes of this critical edition. In Handel's day, I mean, they wouldn't even bother doing that. And half the time, Handel wouldn't even have to write the recitatives. You just had someone had an assistant do it. So then you have the arias. And here's a typical aria. It's scored for strings with the soloist. There they are. Here it is. Note how many lines of music there are. I mean, it ends here. This is another system, as they call it. You've got a couple violins, viola, the voice, and the continuo on the bottom. The accompaniment, the harmonies, like that down here. So it's 3-4 lines of music. And sometimes it could be much less. Bach cantatas are often just a voice and that continuo accompaniment. And the continuo was written down in shorthand. You just put some numbers or figures. It was called a figured bass, which told the guy what harmonies to play. And you just let him go. So it was very, very little. It was much less of a chore to actually write out tons of music. It didn't take you very long to write an aria. And the forms were simpler too. The form of an aria was you'd sing the first part, then there would be a contrasting section, then you do the first part all over again. And you don't even have to write the first part all over again. You just write aria da capo. I mean, take it from the top, and you write a little arrow and say, this is where it ends. So you could write long very, very quickly. And you had to, because the need for music was enormous and the need for variety was constant. And you couldn't even be sure, like I said, that you were going to have your own opera sung by your singers. They might bring their own arias on roughly the same things because they were stock characters with arias written about stock situations, anger, love, vengeance, betrayal, whatever. And they could stick their own music into it half the time. So, the musical text was not considered to be inviolate. It wasn't something anyone had to adhere to with any rigor. In the classical period, composers had to write down quite a bit more. Mozart's operas are very long, and they tend to be written out with much greater elaboration than any Baroque operas, for example, and Mozart's symphonies too. And the reason that happened, it's very interesting historically. The reason this became slower is because halfway through the classical period, the continuo, that wonderful device that allows you to take all the accompanying harmonies and just jam them into a keyboard accompaniment on the bottom, where everybody else on top was a solo voice, essentially, a melody, that disappeared. It disappeared as in the classical period, the ideal became that every instrument should be necessary and self-sufficient. The ensemble should be self-sufficient. So you didn't need that keyboard business on the bottom. But that meant the composers had to write everything down. They had to write every part for every instrument out fully. They had to indicate the dynamics. They had to do the balances. Here is a typical opera by Puccini. This is Tosca, right? So you saw the Handel opera, right? It had, just a few 4 lines of something or other. Well, here's a bit of Tosca with Scarpia from the end of Act 1. Now, all of this entire page is one system. It's one system for a very large, typically large romantic orchestra. Handel's orchestra was mostly strings, and maybe he'd throw in an oboe or a horn or, a few other instruments now and again. But it's basically just a body of strings and 4 parts or so, 5 parts maybe. And that's what he wrote for, and the voice. Handel, he's got one voice. The voice is down here, buried in all of this stuff. It's the evil Scarpia who's singing. And here you've got piccolo, 2 flutes, oboes, English horn, clarinets, bass clarinet, bassoons, contrabassoons, 4 horns, 3 trumpets, or 2 trumpets, 2 or 3 trumpets, 3 trombones and a tuba or chimbasso thing or bass trombone, and a harp, And let's see, there's a bell ringing. Oh no, there's a bell, and there's a cannon firing, and you've got an organ, and then you've got the large string section, and somewhere in there is a singer. So it's enormously more complicated. And you think it didn't take a lot more time to write this than it took to write Handel's Orlando. It did. Now, that doesn't mean one is better than the other. It just means one is a heck of a lot more complicated. And when each piece has to be different from every other piece, and they're much bigger and more complicated, you have to write everything down and indicate everything very carefully. And you're doing it essentially on spec. That is, someone may commission you to write an opera, or you may decide to write an opera or a symphony or a string quartet just by yourself because that's what you want to do. And then you have to go out finding someone who's willing to pay for it, pay to listen to it, pay to produce it, pay to do something. That stretched the time scale out immeasurably. So in a nutshell, very, very simply, the difference is patronage, who paid for it, who the composers wrote for, how much business they could expect to get, and then aesthetics, changing musical taste, changing musical conceptions of what a work is, the view of how important the work had to be, and there you go. And geniuses, of course, were comfortable doing either way. They could be romantic geniuses or classical or Baroque geniuses. They could be very prolific, or they could be extremely, extremely abstemious in the substance and size of their production. But there's no question that later composers wrote less because they had fewer opportunities for performance. They weren't required to write so much. And because they felt that each work that they produced, if they were large works, if they were major works, had to be of a certain importance, a certain significance, a certain size and level of detail. And so there you go. Now, that didn't stop certain modern composers from being insanely prolific, right? I mean, Hovannes wrote 60 some odd symphonies. Leif Segerstam, the conductor, is also a composer. God, he's written hundreds and hundreds of symphonies. But it's interesting because most of those use some sort of musical shorthand method of composition. That is, they have random elements, or they're written out in such a way that composers and musicians can improvise things that they do, or they're all playing separate things at separate times. If you want to write 100 symphonies, there's nothing stopping you. You just have to do it in such a way that economizes on the amount of time. So you write for smaller ensembles. You use score methods, whether traditional or avant-garde, that are extremely economical and convenient and easy to support rapid production of numerous pieces. Most composers today don't do it that way. They don't. They run the risk of being labeled as superficial and cheap and quality instead of, quantity instead of quality type people. And they don't want that. No, they want to be taken very seriously. So there is value in scarcity. And that is what the Romantic period taught composers. That there is value in scarcity. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. I hope this answers your question. Take care.